So this is the first of a number of videos I'm going to put together about working with timber, and it's for WJEC construction as we're about to start the carpentry unit. So in advance of kind of getting any tools out, I think it's probably quite good to spend a bit of time looking at wood, timber, and the different sort of categories of timber that we can get, and the difference between timber and wood, and some of the properties of it. So first of all, I've got two pieces of timber here, to call it its proper name, timber rather than wood. Timber is processed wood, okay? It's been machined, it's been dried out, it's been seasoned, and ready for us to use in construction jobs. So it might be cutting a roof in, which would be sort of site carpentry, or it might be doing joinery work, which would be making things like staircases and maybe kitchens and things like that, joinery. So let's have a look at the sort of timber that you might use for those jobs. So this would be used for decorative joinery, which is a piece of oak. So as you can see, it's got a kind of nice colour to it, and the grain is nicely picked out to the detail here. Piece of oak, this is a hardwood, it's quite expensive really then, so it's a slow growing material. Oak. There's lots of other hardwoods that you can sort of come across as well, and I'll kind of categorise you and tell you the difference between hardwoods and softwoods in a minute. This timber then probably wouldn't be on show quite so much, possibly. This is a piece of pine, but if you're making kind of carcassing or framework for something, then pine would commonly be used. Also as a construction timber for making things like door frames, roofs and joists for floors and things like that. This is a piece of pine. So pine is a softwood. So let's look at the difference between softwoods and hardwoods for a minute then. So hardwoods and softwoods, it's got nothing to do with the actual hardness of the timber. It's more to do with the properties of the tree that it comes from. So hardwood trees are deciduous. In other words, during the winter, they lose their leaves. So in autumn time, the leaves start to go a yellowy brown colour and then they fall off. And that's the sign that it's a hardwood tree. So a hardwood, oak, you've got elm, beech, ash, all those other trees that you get around that go bare in the winter, they're your hardwoods. And our hardwoods tend to be very slow growing, and the way you can tell that really is if you look at the end grain of the wood, the growth rings are actually quite close together. That tree is only putting on a small amount to its waste every year. So with oak, there's a common saying which is it takes 100 years to grow, 100 years to live, and 100 years to die. So a 300-year-old oak tree wouldn't be a terribly old oak tree. They do grow a lot older than that as well. So when we use oak, we have to think carefully. It's not really a sustainable resource, so we're cutting it down to use it. If we're planting another one at the same time, it's going to be quite a long time before that's able to be used and harvested sustainably. On the other hand, you've got your softwoods. Okay, so softwoods, if you look at the end grain now, the growth rings are much further apart. Now what that means is the pine tree, the softwood tree, is putting on a larger amount of growth every season, and that means the tree probably in about 30 years would be about 20-25 metres tall, and that is sustainable. So what we can do, the Forestry Commission put out huge plantations of wood, and they manage that resource, and they cut it down and machine it, and knowing that next year there'll be another tree which will reach maturity. And so those pieces of timber are sustainable. So if it's got an FSC brand on, a Forestry Stewardship Council brand on it, it's like a tree with a tick mark on it, you know that it's come from a managed resource and it's okay to use. So that's your softwoods, and we're solely going to be using softwoods. Okay, I'm going to put the hardwood to one side, and this timber that we're going to be using to make our sawhorse is called CLS. It stands for Canadian Lumber Standard, and it is a piece of timber which is guaranteed to be relatively knot-free and straight as well. So it's good for construction jobs. It's passed certain grading tests. Right, so let's have a look at some of those things. They're not free. What did I mean by not free? Well, knots are these kind of swirl marks you get in the timber, and you get small knots and you get big knots. And if you've got big knots in your timber, you stand a chance of weakening the timber. So if you put a knot where you're going to try and make something structural, there's a good chance it's going to break. Also, if you're trying to cut a joint out where there's a knot, you're going to find it's possibly going to split. So knots are not necessarily your friend there, okay? And knots are spelled K-N-O-T-S, all right, like a knot you tie in a shoelace. Okay, what other defects can you get in wood? Well, wood, when it grows, is full of moisture. So the way the tree gets the water from the ground, it pulls out these capillaries in between the rings of the growth rings on the wood, and it drags them up to the top of the tree. So that might be 20-25 meters, like I said before, and that tree will be very moist when it's cut down. So when you want to use it, you don't really tend to use moist or green wood so much. You want to dry it out. So drying wood, or seasoning wood we call it, can be done naturally. So if you stack wood very carefully with props and little air gaps in between them, it can dry out, and it can dry out straight naturally. Okay, if you don't stack it properly, then the wood can dry out with a bend in it. So as it dries out, one side dries more than the other, and you get a big bend in it. If you go to the timber yard, a good thing to do is to line your eye up with the length of the wood and see if there's a bend in it as you look down the length of the wood. Also, as wood dries out, you can have these things called shakes, which is where a split occurs and then propagates or kind of grows down the length of the timber. So knots, warped wood, and shakes and splits in the wood can be big problems. So look out for those. If you're also looking at timber from a timber yard, probably best to check that it's well seasoned, so all the moisture has been driven out of it. Either naturally seasoned timber or kiln dried. So with a kiln drying process, that wood would be put inside a large cylindrical oven, and the moisture is heated up and forced out of the timber in a process that probably takes a couple of days rather than a couple of months really to do. So processing the wood, cutting into planks, cutting into certain sizes, ready for us to use for our carpentry jobs. So like I say, we're using CLS, Canadian Lumber Standard, 63 by 38 millimeters is its finished size, okay? And that's what we're going to be using. And we're going to have a piece which is 4.8 meters long. That's a very long piece of timber, so you're going to be using it and cutting it to size. All right, so I'll leave that there for the time being. A bit about woods and different kinds of timbers. Rewind if you need to with those bits, but there's some questions that you're going to be answering in the Google form that this video is going to be attached to.